Hello, and welcome to the fourth episode of Practical Evolution. Today, we have special guest Caleb Davies with us. He is an educational psychologist. He's currently doing his PhD. And we met on a Vipassana 10-day meditation course. So do you want to tell us a bit about yourselves, Caleb?
Yeah, nice to be here. First of all, assistant EP.
Okay.
I'm not qualified at this point, and I've got a journey to go for that to happen. But I've been a assistant EP now for just under a couple of years. I was a teacher beforehand in secondary schools, and sort of straight out of uni, straight working in schools and stuff. So got quite a lot of sort of experience in education, etc. I'm currently doing a PhD in research at Northumbria University. I'm sort of working on a few different projects, but the one that I'm leading on is looking at developing an intervention specifically in secondary schools to trying to promote a sense of belonging or sort of a sense of connection for students who are in setting. So that's alongside working as well. So I've got a nice mixture of sort of practice as well as research as well. That's what I'm sort of interested in.
Awesome. So how far are you along this sort of journey, as you put it? How much longer have you been doing it? Have you got until you go full into practice, or is there more like you're interested in the academia, want to continue that? What's your sort of journey looking like at the moment?
Yeah, good question. So I'm an assistant EP at the moment, and so what I need to do is get onto the training course to be an EP.
Mm-hmm.
The local authority that I work for, everyone in my position has gone on to become an EP. So there's an expectation that I will get onto the course and train to be an EP. It's getting more and more difficult to get onto the course. It's very, very competitive. You've got to take things as things go. But at the position that I'm in, I'm expected to sort of move on into that role in the future. I am very much interested as well in the research side of things. And so I think really what I'm looking for in terms of my journey is to have a split role where I'm educational psychologist, so I'm working in schools, practically supporting schools with including young people, understanding young people with special educational needs, but then also planning like what should that support look like, sort of collaborating, etc. But then what I think is really powerful is in research, you can have an impact beyond any specific individual or beyond even an individual setting as such, where you can influence sort of policy across the nation or international research. What I'm really interested in is multidisciplinary team working, because I think that I think it happens with every profession, that if you're working with your colleagues who are all in the same role, that's really helpful because you share similar expertise, similar values, etc. But what you often miss is a wider picture of things, and there's always a sense that you fall into sort of a group think where you can't help but have a narrow perspective on things, even though as EPs we try to look holistically, and that's our sort of niche as such. There's so much benefit in working with other individuals in education, in psychology, in sort of politics, etc., just to get a more rounded understanding to have that impact on a higher level. So I guess long term, I'm aiming for that joint role, and where I can make an impact as much as I can, really, to improve outcomes for young people. That's my aim.
That is awesome. So is this interdisciplinary sort of side of things, does that include you focusing on the research, like more so than like other people would if they're like in the practice and in the day to day? Do you think that helps you get that wider perspective if you're able to sort of go off and do the more abstract and then come back to the concrete? Does you think that helps you have that like more balanced perspective?
Definitely. I think there are opportunities in practice to work collaboratively with other professionals. And I think in the current climate, that's not happening as much as we'd like to happen. We've sort of there's just not enough EPs, and there's not enough other professionals as well who are supporting around in those educational environments. So those opportunities are not as often as you might like them to be. They do happen and they are there. But I think with my interest in research is I always want to find definitive answers where that's not always possible, and sometimes it is impossible to do that. But I think there's always should be an aim that we're moving towards something. And I think something in the profession of research that very much is the goal, to build on a knowledge base over time and to contribute to that as best as you can. Whereas I think as in practice, quite often you might be thinking creatively and finding creative solutions to problems in practice. We don't necessarily think about them and communicate them in ways which allow that knowledge to build up over time, especially to do with sort of some of the language that we use. And so I think it can be really powerful to have people who are sort of doing a bit of both.
So you sort of see maybe psychology sort of over time becoming more of a hard science with more sort of precise terminology as such, or at least you have a feeling that that's the way you want it to go, whether or not it ends up there. Do you have a comment on that? Or
it's something we've spoke about before, isn't it? In terms of what I personally find interesting about psychology is it is on that boundary of the objective and the subjective, and I think there'll probably potentially always be an element of that where it's on the boundaries and it's open to interpretation. But I think if you look at trends in other disciplines, then it seems that when something becomes more objective in the scientific domains, that's when the most amount of progress is enabled. So I think what really holds us back as a discipline is the fact that we very rarely agree on the definitions of concepts, and the language that we use is highly inconsistent. And I think what that then leads to is you've got lots of groups of individuals or groups, organizations who are all aiming towards the same thing, but it isn't necessarily recognized because they're all speaking a different language, even though they're looking and trying to help with the same things. So that's definitely something that I'm quite passionate about in terms of trying to move the discipline towards objective understandings of things where possible.
Because to me, I'm quite the same, and sort of I like to find the principles or the models that are more like universally true or useful, we've talked about. And then to me that sort of feels like the essence of science as well. It's like it's a truth seeking algorithm to eventually get a better view of reality. And I was also thinking about the subjective objective. You also mentioned the sort of idea of process and outcome, and how maybe that is also subjective objective, and how that sort of is the other side of the equation of like feedback and stuff like that. Does that make sense? So do you think that maybe as it goes on you become more outcome focused, or do you think you remain in a process driven world?
Well, that's I think that's probably one of the main drivers of why the subjective is such an important part of psychology.
Yeah.
Because I think we've mentioned before, haven't we, where if we're looking, psychology is looking at people's lives. And if you look at the outcome of life, you know, it's death, isn't it? And that's not, if you're focusing on the outcome of life, then you're probably missing the bit that makes it valuable, which is that bit in between, which is that experience of being alive.
Yeah.
And so by nature, the profession and the discipline will always be interested in that middle bit, right? In the process of life. And but that's not to say that within that we can't develop a more objective understanding of people's experiences over time as well.
Mm.
In many senses, it's much more complex than some hard sciences, and it's the complexity which is what makes it harder, and will take more time for us to be able to develop those models, those theories, those approaches, etc., which can give us a more clearer and consistent understanding across individuals, in their individual circumstances, and also across groups of individuals, and obviously across cultures and, you know, countries, etc., as well.
Yeah, so on that, like with the psychological aspect, obviously everyone having a sort of subjective experience, lots of people end up finding tools for themselves and like processes that they end up, you know, they go to meditation or some other sort of framework that helps them sort of process a situation or function in life. Do you think that's like an aspect to like almost psychologicalizing, or I don't know how you would conceptualize that, but that is important to like empower people so that you end up giving them the tools, the psychological tools? Is that part of how you view it? Like you're giving them the framework or the model to operate themselves going forward?
Yeah, within, well, in terms of the context of an EP, we come into a school, and there are many questions which school staff want us to answer.
Yeah.
The nature of those answers, so the questions would often be around, you know, why is this young person finding it difficult to engage in lessons? Why are they behaving or presenting in a certain way? Or and the answers to these questions, quite often, is a matter of perspective. So what we do is we sort of try to take into account as many perspectives as possible, and then we try to synthesize that in a way that's meaningful for an individual. And so when you're thinking about wider, and you're thinking about psychology in general, I think it's that synthesis of understanding really resonates with people depending on the experiences and understanding that they bring to a situation. And
Yeah.
so in terms of psychology as a tool, then the tools that we can give people, the utility of those tools are going to depend on that individual. This is where the subjectivity comes in, because, you know, there's lots of, let's say there's somebody who struggles with the mood and sort of has, you know, presents with some sort of depressive symptoms, etc. And, you know, there's a whole sort of lot of research that suggests there's a few things that might help in that situation for that person, but it's not until that person goes on the journey themselves and finds the things that may or may not help them, does then those approaches have any meaning to anybody. So it's the way people interpret and use the tools in psychology which makes them meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Have you found it particularly useful for you, like as like a part of this pursuit of knowledge for you? Do you find it useful to you in your life and how you sort of go about? Do you find these concepts? Obviously, you're helping other people, and that is a lot of your sort of priority. But do you find them of value to you? Do you find them practical, or maybe how so?
Are you asking in relation to sort of the Vipassana mindfulness techniques, or more generally, or
more generally, like do you find that when you learn about psychology, if you do touch on any principles, do they become of value or like a level of insight or thing that helps you in your life? So maybe start with psychology and we can go into mindfulness later.
It's a good question. So in some sense, there's a bit of a cliche in psychology.
Yeah.
And I think probably it reflects in other disciplines as well. But there's always a reason why somebody develops an interest in psychology. And quite often that can involve not necessarily negative experiences, but experiences of close family members or friends, or some experiences around mental health.
Yeah.
Or inquisitism around the mind, and needing to need a desire to want to know more for various different reasons. And that's very much reflects in my own experiences of why I'm interested in psychology. And it's an interesting idea about if you are a psychologist, people might expect your relationships to be particularly strong or healthy, or that your mental state is expected to be better because you have all of this understanding about it. It's
You'd
like,
hope.
well, if someone's asking for some support, how are you supposed to give them support if you aren't living by those values, or if you can't put into practice the things that you recommend, etc. And I think in some ways, I think that makes a lot of sense, because if you went, I don't know, if you met a builder and he built his own house and the house wasn't built very well, you'd think, oh, well, I don't want you coming around building my house. He's got a plumber, he's got leaky taps. It's like, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. But
yeah.
And maybe there is a correlation between that in some senses of a psychological knowledge and a ability to navigate the world in a helpful way. There might be, but at the same time, it can be quite paradoxical as well. Because I think like comedians, for example, so often comedians are the funniest person in the room, and they bring so much light and energy and happiness to the people around them. But when you delve into some of the stories of these people, quite often you will find actually a lot of that stems from a lot of negative experiences and emotions, which are not evident on the surface of their presentations. And so I guess in some ways, there's potentially a lot of parallels with psychologists in terms of why did they become a psychologist. And it certainly doesn't make you a superhuman. It doesn't change. It might change the way you interpret some of your emotions, but it doesn't change the fact that you experience them. And everybody's life journeys are different, aren't they? So
yeah,
it doesn't necessarily translate as clearly as it might seem like it should in some instances.
Okay, that is interesting. Yeah, because from my perspective, I've always sought maybe information on the mind to like a means to an end. It was always, I want to learn sort of maybe some psychological principles, how I can reinterpret something in a more beneficial way. And it was always with that end sort of in a beneficial way. So it was always that orientation. And so that is interesting. That is like, it doesn't always correlate that way, but I guess you also end up falling in love with sort of the study of everything and the research and helping other people that maybe you don't always you're not always looking at it to like benefit you as such. But that is interesting. So would you be able to talk about some of the research you've been doing and the recent paper? Maybe you're sick of talking about it, or because you've worked so long on it. But I was quite interested in hearing more about it, and yeah, I know roughly the concepts as we spoke about it before, but just for everyone listening, I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Always happy to talk about ongoing projects. So I've got the research group that I'm a part of at the moment. We've got two publications around attendance, which have recently been submitted to journals. And what we're really looking at in those publications is trying to get a clear understanding of the factors involved in attendance, in the context of young people who find it really difficult to attend school. I think the approaches that were taken, well, we're split into 3 papers actually, but one's not being submitted yet. We've looked at a systematic review of attendance interventions. We've tried to do a meta-analysis of previous interventions. Unfortunately, the research is just not robust enough internationally in order to create a quantitative analysis of the results of previous interventions. I think that's a bit of a reflection of the complexity of attendance in general. And when you look at attendance internationally, the contexts are so vastly different. I've learned an incredible amount sort of supporting on these publications. There's, for example, in Africa, or different parts of Africa, I'm thinking Kenya, in South Africa, to places, their barriers to young people attending school are quite often financial barriers, and also hygiene barriers as well, sort of access to contraceptives, and sort of the ability to actually travel to school, and to be able to afford to the equipment and the clothing, etc., the uniform. And then there's also sort of cultural barriers. I think what's come through is, especially for sort of young girls, there's different cultures where education is just not prioritized for young people, but I think specifically for many girls, which is a very different context to what it is in England, for example, where the narrative around attendance in most cases, or at least in the majority of cases, is around sort of mental health, and the barriers being able to navigate complex sensory social environments. And then I'm thinking I've read a study based in Finland, and it's got a lot of similarities to England in terms of its level of economic development. I think some of the culture is quite similar, but their understanding or their models of attendance is actually not as complex as ours in England or in other parts of the world, because they have some of their cultural barriers and their community sort of community environments are not as prominent of a barrier for them in Finland as it is in other countries of a similar economic development. And so their models are more simplistic because the problem of attendance is a simpler model, and it's not as much of a problem for them, although of course there's still young people who can't or find it hard to attend. And so in this systematic review, we've tried to bring lots of different cultural approaches into one review. And of course, because of that, the interventions can be difficult to sort of compare and to contrast between. But we've the other two papers are where we've collected primary data with staff members, with students, and also with caregivers. One where we've tried to use a quantitative approach to identify the prominent factors that are involved, as well as trying to get an understanding of how the factors change depending on the level of what we call severity, so whether they're attending 90% or less, or whether they're attending 50% or less, to see how it changes as the severity of attendance difficulties change. We found it very difficult to collect data and engage stakeholders in the paper, and we have, for the quantitative paper, only been able to include staff in that, even though we've tried to include young people and caregivers as well. We've included caregivers, not staff and children, but it's still giving us a good understanding, at least of the caregiver's perspective, because there's not actually a lot of research that is representing their views, which I think is an increasing trend for us to look at. The qual paper does look at all three, and it involves sort of focus groups with the three different groups, and the analysis of that data was is an ongoing task. So that one's going to take longer because the analysis is taking quite a bit longer. And what that is really showing is how every individual case is so different to every other. It's really far from a homogeneous group of young people. The reasons and the context that each young person finds themselves in is just so varied. So that's one reason why the analysis is taking so long with that. But yeah, I've really enjoyed being part of these publications, and yeah, been good.
Awesome. So with the challenge of this like lack of data, or maybe disjoint data that's hard to make conclusions from, do you see like the way out of that is like applying more of these things, or is it like maybe we need more data, we need higher quality data or more specific data to our use cases? Like, how do you see the sort of the landscape of data and how that needs to change for you to make more appropriate conclusions?
Yeah, well, one of the biggest barriers to research in education is access to real-world education environments. Schools are an incredibly hectic, busy environment with a whole host of pressures. The environment is so dynamic, and nothing is ever taken away from schools. There's always something added to it, always added to the mix, of sort of government initiatives, etc. It just adds more and more pressure onto schools. So it's a very difficult environment to recruit participants. But then to add to that, what makes it even more difficult is the young people and the parents, etc., that we try to recruit for these sort of studies are particularly vulnerable as well. So it's sort of those two things put together. If a young person is not attending, is attending school for less than 50% of the time, then you very much would classify them as a vulnerable person. And sometimes the reasons for that disengagement or lack of attendance is the exact reason that makes it difficult to recruit them for research as well. So although the initial scope was the northwest of England, and when we expanded it nationally, we still found it very difficult to recruit all three perspectives into the research, and it's a real problem in educational research in general.
Yeah, I can imagine that if you don't have that data, you can't really make the conclusions, because especially like you need that high quality data, and there's so many variables, as you're saying. Like you really got to look at like the total picture, and you've got culture impacting it, you got parents, you got the type of school, the location, I can just imagine it's like there's so much to consider to have like a controlled experiment, as you would traditionally think in science, where you change one variable is pretty much impossible, right? That's like a long way away from sort of where we're at. So do you find yourself sort of leaning towards certain types of interventions? Is there any sort of favoritism you have to certain types, or are you trying to like be as unbiased as possible and you're exploring lots of different options, you coming up with your own? You've mentioned about sort of the problem solving aspect of that as well, and trying to think of through these processes and how to best come up with them.
Well, if it was my oral viva, then I absolutely am trying to be as unbiased as possible. That's definitely, it's a very important part of the process, and it's also arguably an impossible process to achieve. I think my research is predominantly is in education, which is technically different to psychological research. But obviously, with my understanding of psychology too, every psychological researcher, well, say every, I've not met one that hasn't agreed that you can't eliminate bias in your pursuit of knowledge, just in general and in research. And I've seen firsthand how you think a paper's objective, but then when you undergo the process yourself, you think, my gosh, there's been some arbitrary decisions in this. And even if you articulate it as best as you can in your methodology, etc., there's always going to be an element of that in everything that we do. In terms of interventions, I think it's a tough one, because something about objectivity suggests that we shouldn't use prior knowledge to influence the characteristics of the interventions that we research. But actually, if you take that to the extreme, it would be impossible then to develop interventions, because maybe not impossible, but it would be inefficient, because it's not taking into account prior research, if that makes sense. To me, you would want to iterate on success. You would want an iterative process on an existing intervention. That would make sense to me. Don't know if that is the process, but so I think in terms of the types of interventions I'm interested in, and also what probably the national and international, at least in the West, the trend is towards sort of socio-emotional approaches. So there's quite a strong narrative in education at the moment of this contrast between a relational approach and a traditional authoritarian approach. And I guess within my within my own research, one thing that I am motivated by in terms of its overarching impact is that I'm supporting that, I would say, a transition from traditional approaches to behavior management and educational environments to a more relational, socio-emotional, modern approach. And so within that, I do bring a bias, in a sense, of what I am looking at promoting in many ways that I can't deny that isn't the case, really. I've got the full project of my PhD, which is developing an intervention. That is the actual intervention pilot itself is probably about 2, maybe 3 years away. Because what's happened is I've undergone a systematic review of previous interventions, similar to the attendance publication, actually. And then I'm currently putting together the ethics approval for the sort of a co-design phase of the intervention. So I'll be sort of engaging staff, caregivers, and children in focus groups around first of all, what it means to belong to a setting, and then also looking at there's a framework that's recently come out called a sense of belonging integrative framework, and I'm going to use that to structure the questions, reflective questions around how can we promote belonging in secondary schools, because I think almost no matter whether you're on the sort of traditional authoritarian side of the relational side, I think pretty much everyone recognizes that there's something not quite hitting the mark in a majority of secondary schools. The evidence of exclusions and attendance data and other metrics really do show that there's something going wrong there. And so it is really important in that process that when I'm listening to people's perspectives, that I am being unbiased in what I'm listening to, because I need to be open to them saying something which I wouldn't say myself, or I wouldn't know myself. I mean, the whole point of conducting the research is to learn from it. And so it's really important to be, I think, the values of open-mindedness and being as unbiased as possible in your analysis, etc., is key to producing, well, say groundbreaking but progressive research. Because if you're completing research and not expecting to learn anything, then you're not it's just regurgitating what's already known. And so it's a really important value to try to be as open-minded as possible when you undergo these projects.
Would you mind expanding on socio-emotional and maybe what that means for the people listening and to me? Because I have a rough idea, but if you wouldn't mind explaining what that means in practice or in types of intervention.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So socio-emotional interventions, I could have called them psychosocial, which is something a little bit different, a little bit broader. But socio-emotional is essentially, there's two main aspects to that. You've got social and then you've got emotional. And so what these interventions look at is developing the capacity of young people, the capacity to be social. So looking at sort of their social skills, their interactive skills, their understanding and navigation of social environments. And then also the emotional side is very much looking at their emotional regulation. So their emotional literacy, so how they're understanding their emotions, how they're able to communicate them, and also how they're able to regulate emotions as they come and go. And so these sort of interventions are characterized by building the skills, the underlying skills of young people, and prioritizing holistic development in young people, as opposed to, I don't want to use a straw man, but as opposed to a traditional approach, which is looking almost solely at academic outcomes. So in many ways, it is this almost counter position of the traditional approach, in that actually we're saying that, okay, academic outcomes are important, but actually what's more important, that these young people, after they leave school, are able to understand themselves and others, to be able to communicate effectively in groups, and to be good, rounded people.
Yeah.
Which I don't, like I said, I don't use straw man into traditional approaches, but that's sort of what socio-emotional interventions as such as a category are trying to achieve.
Yeah. So you mentioned a couple of things there that so on the aspect of like skills, you're trying to sort of develop the child in a way, or support them in a way where they maybe develop these literacy and regulation skills that would help them going forward in life. And like maybe that is something that like they should have developed by that point, or maybe they're like lagging in a developmental way that requires an intervention, and maybe we need better feedback systems where you can identify that before something goes wrong, like attendance. Or there's a sense to me that like something has gone, like these things are like symptoms of something a lot deeper, or a lot more personal to this sort of upbringing that would lead to that. And sorry, I'm getting one sec. Yeah, and I like that aspect of like skills, because I often come back to that as a sort of a framework for myself. It's like, okay, if I'm struggling with maybe an emotion or something, or like clearly it's my skill to regulate it that is something to work on, rather than like blaming the thing that is causing the reaction. And I find that like a really like useful frame to think of things as like, maybe it's just a lack of skill, like it's a skill issue. I don't know if you've heard of the meme, but it's like often you can be like, it's a skill issue, and then maybe it's hard for a child or someone sort of maturing in that sense to like blame themselves in a weird way, but like it's quite a responsible outlook. I find especially for responsible adults, sort of growing up and maturing, it's like having that frame is very responsible, and I'm always pro responsibility in that sense. Do you like thinking about skills in that sense? Do you see like a lot of maybe issues in your space like related to skills? Is there other ones you wanted to touch on, or do you think that's a different frame than like environment and the authoritarian sort of perspective you were talking about?
Yeah, well, I think one thing I always try to be is reflective of how my understanding is a reflection of the time period that we're in, because in some ways you can't have a position without there being a counter position.
Yeah.
And the way that you understand your own perspective is through the perspective of other people, etc. And so when I will say I promote social emotional approaches, probably daily in my practice, and it's not that I think that this is the best way, or the most important thing to prioritize for education all the time throughout different time periods. But I think there seems to be, in terms of the young people today and the changes in the environment that they are experiencing, I think something like COVID sort of accelerated some of this, but also exacerbated it in different ways. A young the average young person today, I'm trying to think of some research as a quote that I'm trying to think of from Michelle Barber. But the idea is that a 15-year-old today has got the same socio-emotional development of a 7-year-old 50 years ago.
Wow.
Which is a shocking statement to make, a really shocking statement to make. And if you look, the way that statement is justified is if you're looking actually at the relational environment of young people today, it is impoverished compared to how it was in the past. With the rise of the sort of highly personalized technological social media world that we live in today, all the incidental interactions that we have when we get a bus or when we go to a restaurant, or I'm not religious, but when people went to church or went and joined and congregated in physical spaces, that's been over the last 50 years has been eroded over time. And I think something like COVID, obviously, when we're told we can't socialize with others and we're not allowed to leave our homes and all that sort of thing, I think that's made this trend much more pronounced. And I think it was moving towards this. So like with restaurants now, almost every restaurant you can use a QR code, which I don't think it would have happened at this point in 2024 if it wasn't for COVID. I think it might have moved towards it, but it probably a few years ago before it was so pronounced. And young people today just aren't having interactions with as much depth and quality, or the range of interactions with people. And so a lot of what skills that our generations and previous generations had in terms of their social emotional capacity, we took for granted. Because we think, I mean, I don't know what you think, but I personally, until I started this job, didn't realise that my relationship with my mum and with my grandmother and with my family and with my friends, and how I have developed to be the person that I am because of them. Like, okay, I've helped maybe in some weird way with develop my mum's capacity as well, but the idea is that actually without those interactions, you don't develop an ability to socialize with other people or to understand and regulate your emotions, and for goal-directed motivations, etc. Like that just doesn't happen by itself. It happens through an interaction with the environment. And so when you're looking at the base level of socio-emotional skills that young people have today, it's significantly lower than previous generations. And so education now needs to prioritize, or always should prioritize the needs of the young people in that context of the time. And there's no greater need for socio-emotional development for young people today than there ever has been before. And we never know what the future holds, but it seems as though this trend is not going to disappear anytime soon. So schools and systems and the government, etc., we need to respond to the needs of young people today. And that's a tough old process that takes a very long time, and research is one avenue, one driver of that change over time.
Yeah. Could some of that solution look like encouraging or incentivizing social interaction? And a thought comes to mind is that, do you need like just kids interacting with kids? Does that develop them the same way than an adult interacting with a kid? Like maybe a more developed sort of emotional socio being would help a child more in their development than another child, and maybe like you need that maybe more one-on-one interaction or more like speaking and communicating and interfacing with people. And effectively, a school is a community in some sense, right? It is a form of, we should be a community here, not a bunch of individuals that are like given a test for an hour and meant to look down at a piece of paper. It's like it should be a place for building connections, and obviously kids do that themselves, but there should be a sense of encouragement there, I feel like. And maybe that's what, maybe schools get more social over time. That would be like a nice trend, but also the problem is that technology is such a dopamine draw to many young children that it takes up so much of that time, and that critical time, which I feel like is in the early years of development, which like you build a really strong foundation for these like fundamental social interactions. And it's like you can't really encourage that preschool. That is down to parenting to some sense, and there's all these factors where I feel like technology is such a net positive in my eyes. Obviously, I work with technology, but also we're social creatures, we're social beings, and you need that development to. And I hadn't really correlated it as much as what you're saying, like that those relationships actually determine how you emotionally regulate yourself. And I hadn't quite made that connection before, but that's really interesting. How would you touch on maybe parenting, or how like those early developmental sort of years are really important for developing those skills, and maybe how they've atrophied because of the current era we're in?
Yeah, well, if you are interested in sort of understanding and learning more about it, I think this perspective is informed by attachment theory.
Attachment theory.
That's sort of the psychological approach model.
Yeah.
Paradigm, maybe is a better word. It's sort of attachment theory really highlights the importance of early relationships, but also relationships throughout the lifespan, and how our development is so inextricably linked with those interactions with others. I see very often in this role. I'm always wary in this role that we work with we want to put a number on it, like the 10% of young people that are struggling in school for various different reasons. But we very regularly come across young people where they have a particular set of life experiences or circumstances where the relationships with important people in their lives it wasn't how you would want it to be, or there was things happen in life and different things that you can't account for, and they can have a lasting impact in some circumstances. And so when you talk about young people in general, I think that base level is lower. And then obviously we work specifically with young people where that is often even lower than the average as such, in their sort of experiences, etc. It's a good question you're asking about how can parents respond to this changing environment for young people today? Because I mean, a parent can be a massive part of a young person's life, and it's impossible to be perfect all the time, which is one thing which we do some trauma-informed training. One of the points we make to school staff, but in general, is you only have to get things, as a parent, you only have to get things right about 40% of the time, which often relieves a lot of people. Because I know that ourselves, we don't have children or anything, but I can sort of imagine, definitely not fully, but I can sort of imagine, the pressures that it is to raise children is immense. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do, I'm sure. And yeah, you only have to get things right 40% of the time. But there is some evidence to suggest, like say some actually, there's substantial growing evidence to suggest that we need to be really wary about how early we introduce technology to children and the extent of their interactions with technology.
Yeah.
It was a colleague circulated a document this week or last week even. I can't remember which organisation it was, but I think there's guidance coming out about how technology use from a young age is impacting on their attentional skills, their mental health, and their academic outcomes, etc. And that's not to scare people to say, right, get rid of iPads, can't watch TV, no mobile phones. That's not the case as such. But one thing that parents can think, if there's a question that they can think about, is what is a young person when a young person is using technology?
Yeah.
What does it mean that they're not doing?
Yeah.
Because I think in large aspects, the potential negative outcomes of technology use for children is not necessarily the act of using the technology itself. It's what are the experiences, what are the interactions, what are the skills that they're not learning or developing as a result of using the technology itself. Because what a correlation can be is that actually if a young person, let's say at 2 years old, is spending 6 hours a day on an iPad, what they're not doing is having interactions with their caregivers as much. They're not exploring the world through touch and through taste and through sight, and that young people develop from exploratory play-based learning.
Yeah.
And well, it's important that they do that. And if they're not doing that, then we know that can have a negative outcome. So I think it's important to think about ensuring that there's opportunities for young people to develop into rounded individuals, which can be really difficult as well when you've got lots of pressures yourself as a parent to support that person.
I would like to see sort of a cultural shift in incentives as well. Like, as obviously it's like, as a parent, you can do the best you can and give them the most enriching, but if there was communities around you, you've communities that are encouraging those sort of things, I think that helps massively as well. And there is to me, it seems like the trend of communities has gone down with this sort of increase in either the collective or the individual, and sort of missing those more like niche, sort of narrower groups of people that are encouraging. And it seems like that's maybe, it's like it's been on a downward trend, and maybe it's a pendulum, or maybe it's something we have to learn, that it is important and there is actually reasons why we had those things in place. They helped with our development, they helped with our sort of mental health and all these things. I think that's really interesting sort of take on that. And as optimistic as I like to remain, it's like part of me wants to say that, like, even if maybe you did like stunt your growth for a bit, like, do you believe there's like a redeemable factor to this? Like, maybe you delay your growth, but like maybe in your 20s, you're struggling, you're sort of developing what a teenager would be emotionally. And then you end up catching up by the time you're like late 20s, 30s sort of thing. Do you think that that's maybe a possibility? I don't know. I'm guessing at the moment, but it feels like that could be a positive lens on this. If people sort of jump on it while they notice it as a deficit.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what lens you're looking at, in the sense of, are you looking on an individual level, an individual, or are you looking at more maybe a group level?
Yeah.
Because on an individual level, we know that young people all develop at different stages and different rates in different ways, and it's not necessarily. I struggle if someone says, that a young person isn't capable of doing something. It's like, well, they're 7 years old. Like, when we're 25, maybe we can do that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, I would never want to discount anyone on an individual level, that they can't become the best person that they can be. I think it always the aim to empower people to, of any age, to pursue, to be that best version of themselves that they can be. I think on a group level, it's really easy again for older generations to look at the newer generation and go, "Oh, you can't do this, you can't do that. There's something wrong with you," or blaming, like, "Oh, it's for TVs," or before it was the radio, or there's always some new technology which comes about, which is a change for older generations, which naturally we can be anxious of change as we get older, which is not necessarily maladaptive as well, depending on the context. But what is less clear for older generations to understand about a new generation is the things that they can do that the older generations can't do.
Yeah.
And so we naturally always start with the negatives, because they're often the ones that are most obvious and apparent to people. To me, I mean, this might be wrong, we don't know, but to me, young people who are 10 years old today, when they get to the age where they're in a workplace, they're not going to have the same profile of skills, cognitive abilities, etc., as the generations before that.
Yeah.
Now, it's easy to say, well, it's easier to maybe suggest and to predict what the things that we can't do, but actually we don't know what the flip side to that is. And in many ways, there's strength in numbers, because ultimately, if we have an entire generation of young people which maybe are not well placed to navigate the jobs that we have today, then we will have no choice but to change the job descriptions. There's
Yeah, the supply will shrink up.
If it's a generational trend, then the world will change along with it, because that's how the world works in many instances. The world is set up with a majority of people. So if the majority of people are changing, then the world will eventually, maybe not straight away, change alongside it. And it could be a very exciting future. It's like one of the trends is this idea that young people today, their attentional capacities are reduced, or they find it much harder to sit through an entire film, for example. That's not all young people, but there's a general trend where their attentional capacities are lower than the previous generations. Now, in a deficit model, that sounds really negative, but at the same time, if you take sort of a strengths-based approach to ADHD, what it potentially shows is faster processing speeds. In that, what grabs their attention and what motivates them is a faster paced environment, a more dynamic environment.
Yeah.
And so looking through that lens, there are definitely possibilities of harnessing that to be a productive, helpful, useful adaptation to their cognition.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that in like productivity, and especially as like tools and technology progresses, where it sort of compensates for our maybe depreciating productivity or changing productivity. So it feels like we sort of co-evolve with technology in that sense. I was sort of thinking though that there is, as much as we want to look at the deficits, that it feels like there is a threshold of deficits that like is negatively impacting the individual's either mental health or well-being, or even like ability to achieve a level of like goals that they set for themselves and stuff like that. So it's like, yes, like deficits aren't all bad. You have to look at the whole profile of the skills, but there is a sense it's like, oh, okay, if you have these skills and they're too low, then you will experience like an inability to accomplish things or have like happiness in your life or a level of peace that maybe would be more easily achievable. And so that, yeah, it's like it's a different profile, but like at what cost, you know? At what, yeah. And so yeah, that's the only thing I would add to that, is that it's, yeah, there's thresholds within that could be like more severe and maybe would make life not as fulfilling. But so I would still look at the deficits personally.
Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty in the future, isn't there? Which,
yeah,
I don't think that's, in many ways, that's always been the case. Like, the future is uncertain. If it wasn't, I think we'd live very boring lives in some sense as well. However, the rate of change in our environment and the range of possibilities of change is certainly increasing. So there's a greater unpredictability about the future than there ever has been before. I think that's a fairly, something that we can fairly sort of acknowledge. And we've got to be really careful about managing that rate of change, because as humans, the way that potentially two or more ways that we've adapted to our environment. Obviously, one of the ways is a very, very slow process of biological evolutionary adaptation. But unfortunately, we won't have millions of years to adapt to this change of technology.
Yeah.
We'll have 5, 10, 15 years, sort of, maybe less. I thought, oh, like, it's constantly changing every year at this rate. And so we can't rely on our primary mode of adapting to environments. Instead, we have to use our another thing that we've developed evolutionarily, which is our cognitive flexibility, to adapt to that changing landscape instead. And it's not clear. I mean, if you were to go back in time, say 2,000 years, or even 10,000 years, biologists claim that the underlying structure and genetics of individuals have not changed. However, if you were to meet somebody from 2,000 years ago, you would not be on a level playing field in terms of your abilities.
Yeah.
Because of the environment in which you've grown up in. And so we don't know the extent to which the abilities that we have are as a result of our environment and how much the environment has been at play in the things that we know and understand and can do. So there's very much a possibility in the future that we talk again, in 2,000 years' time, in 100 years' time. Somebody goes back, it goes from the future back to us, and it's not a level playing field again. Like they're light years ahead in how things are developing, etc. But I think what we're at in this moment, in this generation, in this time period, is we're in a transitional phase potentially, in the sense that our current we are prioritizing digital connections over physical connections, and at the moment, digital connections are not equal to physical connections. They do not generate the same depth and quality of experience that a physical interaction produces. However, in the future, I would very much be expectant that the digital interactions that we have are only going to grow in complexity. And actually, I can very much see a future where digital interactions become equal to or more in depth than physical interactions. As obviously you have sort of virtual reality, which is the next step. I'm not saying that that's equal to physical environments at this time, but it's that move towards that simulation, etc., the digital landscape, which means all these things that we're talking about in terms of the limitations of technology and the impact just isn't going to be a problem, because they'll have moved on from that time. But what we're experiencing is, I don't want to say a lost generation, but what we're experiencing is a transitional phase where it is a turbulent context and we're not sure of how best to mitigate some of the problems that can come along with this transitional phase.
Yeah, because as you were saying that, I was imagining like an AI friend, or sort of that you could develop like a social connection to a future sort of artificial intelligence, or maybe have a personal assistant that sort of knows everything about you and has a lot of context and builds up a model of you over time, and it becomes very intimate or something like that. But it's like, I can see that happening. I think that is probably inevitable with where we're at in terms of current technology. And I guess you're right in saying that currently they're not fulfilling these current sort of technological connections we're building. I understand. Yeah, but even then, like a lot of the consumption or time spent on technology isn't necessarily interfacing with people. Like sometimes it's like content, or like social, I guess social media is people, but text isn't people. Watching a video isn't an interaction as such sense. So there's like media consumption or interaction, which is very much like conversation or something different, which I would say. And even then, consumption of media feels like the majority of what you do online. You're not always messaging people.
I think the key component between the digital and physical spaces at the moment is the level of interaction involved in the person, the level of active involvement in that environment. Because if you go back to sort of an infant and they're having interactions with a caregiver, some things are critical to their development, because they're actively engaging in the world. So when when a child is first born, their visual system is far from fully developed. And what infants see when they see their mother, for example, it's not that they see what we would see now with sort of the facial features and the skin tone and the hair. What they see as shapes and squiggles, and because their object recognition and pattern recognition just isn't developed yet. But through their active engagement with their mother, they're building up a cognitive map and understanding to make sense of what they're seeing, what they're doing, etc. And so when it comes to things like shared enjoyment, for example, is that when a mother is laughing and entertaining the child is not passive in that interaction. They're also expressing emotions, and their expressions, they then get feedback about their expressions from that interaction with the mother. And so it's the active component which is what's leading to the development. If that child, baby, was watching a video on YouTube of maybe a similar interaction, it's the active component gone. So it's the passive consumption of media, which is main, for me, seems to be the main characteristic which differentiates the two.
Yeah. And so you could have correct sort of interactions as such, so like you're getting good feedback from your mother when you do certain things, but also it feels like you could end up in this sort of like skewed world where people are raised by like artificial parents and they can't interface with each other once they meet, because they're sort of the cues that they've been trained on are so vastly different to what another person was trained on. I'm talking about humans as if they're neural networks, but it's like you could imagine that being like a weird like dystopia where we end up getting all this weird feedback that isn't sort of biological in origin, it's like artificial in origin, and that seems like a weird world as well. Or maybe that's where we're sort of more, maybe we're more in that world than we realize now as well, which I hadn't thought about before, but yeah, that seems true to me. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I think something like when I've got a couple of cousins who are one's in primary school, one's sort of in high school now, and they've both got a mobile phone, and it's so interesting looking at how they interact with their friends on their mobile phone in the digital space, because the way that they express emotions to each other is very different to before we had mobile phones. I think our generation is very much in this as well sometimes, in the sense of we can put a laughing face as at the end of a message, and sometimes we're laughing, but actually other times we're not, but we still express laughter because that's not the appropriate response in the interaction. And sometimes the disconnection with laughter and the communication of laughter, and we don't necessarily have to go hand in hand like a physical interaction would go. Like you don't announce that you're laughing in a physical interaction, because you don't separate the two. It would be strange to do that with a digital space. So I've met some young people where they can find things amusing or find things upsetting, but you can't tell with their facial expressions. So we call it in psychology, we call it affect. So someone's affectivity is how they're expressing their emotions. So it's the visible manifestation of emotions as such. And so their affect is separated from their actual emotions. Because affectivity, the way we express emotions, is actually socially constructed.
Yeah.
And so because they're doing it a different way, our natural instinct is, oh, that's not right, that's weird. And maybe it is, maybe it's not good. But actually, that's social construct as such. The actual emotion itself is underlying and we can't directly observe it.
Wow. Yeah, I guess I was also thinking about maybe the positive attribute of that is like courage could be explained as like feeling fear, but then not maybe affecting in that sense, or like doing things despite that. So I'm also thinking like you could feel something, but obviously this feels like a more of a deficit frame, not like an aware conscious frame where you would be aware that you're feeling it and you would choose to do it more intentionally. But then that would be more like you're not super aware of what you're feeling and you don't know how to express it or even talk about it, because then there's like no maybe processing or way to get out of a certain state. There's like feels like you're then more dissociated from reality and you can't interface correctly, and that you would end up feeling stuck or unheard or unfulfilled in your communication, and that would develop like levels of avoidance that you wouldn't want to be in social interactions because they would cause these things and you couldn't sort of process them or communicate your way out of them if you didn't have that sort of competence in communicating. That is interesting. I don't know how much time you got left, but I would like to touch on sort of education systems as a whole. So sort of viewing how we've talked about how education systems maybe could be different, or could be maybe it's the curriculum, or maybe it's the structure, or however you see it really. What maybe, or the trend where you see maybe the future of education, like what do you see a real like positive vision for education? Like what could that look like, if you have thought about that or not, or I would be really interested in hearing it.
Yeah, we've got about another 10 minutes, 10 past 8.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, that's a great question. What a positive vision of the future for education. Now that is quite something. It's interesting because I think I certainly would describe myself as a progressive in terms of the education system. And quite often, I think as EPs, we think very optimistically about how things could be. And it's very easy to get carried away with how things could be. Because you realize when you start to actually, when you go back into school, or when something happens, you realize, oh my gosh, we're so far away from any vision that we had. And so it always feels, there's always it's almost a little bit melancholic. Like we have this this optimism of, oh yeah, if we do it like this, this would work, and then you have to there's always a come down after it. It's like, oh God, yeah, but look what's happening. This is just not. But yeah, and you know what? I say I'm progressive, and I am, but I often find myself in those groups also playing devil's advocate and also being cautious in our beliefs and visions as well, because you never know what you have got until you lose it. And so for all of the negatives that you can dwell on about the educational system, specifically in England, actually it's still a very robust system. which is which has a positive protective influence on the majority of young people. We might think there's lots of changes that we can make, and I'm sure that there is, but we have to, like I say, be really careful about what we change, because we don't know the things that we take for granted until we change it and realize, my God, we need to go back. Having said that, I mean, there is lots of things which we could potentially change. It's quite helpful for sure. My sort of idea, I mean, this is sort of okay. I'm going to go for my abstract one. So say like 20 years time.
Okay.
I think schools are already, but will increasingly be, one of the only physical spaces that young people will congregate. It will really be, there'll be, I mean, it might change, but there's not many other places already where actually young people come together physically. And so I think of it almost similar to how I work, in terms of I have a hybrid job. So I do work at home, obviously going to school visits, and then we also have an office to go into. But I use the office space predominantly as a social space rather than a workspace.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Like, we have a bit of a joke in the office where most of us can't actually do work in the office. Like, because what we do, like when we write a report, we'll spend a solid 2-3 hours concentrating on that report. And so actually having people about, and it's just not conducive to being productive. So most of the time when we're in the office, it's so we can make connections, we can network, and we can feel close to each other and have that sense of community. And so, and this is why, you know, the project that I'm undergoing, what really underpins it is we're going to call it school belonging or school connectedness. And what all that is linked to is, how can we generate a sense of community? How can we prioritize a sense of community for young people going to school? Because I think the unique contribution that school will bring is being part of a group of people with, you know, shared experiences. Because school is, again, potentially the only, or one of the only places where they have shared experiences now. The fact that they have to sit in the same lesson and they learn the same things. You know, when they go home now, we're not all watching BBC One at 7 o'clock. You know, we're all having all these different things going on, etc. And so there's something about making the social aspects of school to be the primary motivator and the primary consideration in how we design school environments.
Yeah.
Because I do think in the future as well, if you look at sort of a teacher, the job and role of a teacher, responsibilities, and what the impact of artificial intelligence can have on that. Because we speak quite often about how a personalized learning approach is optimum. And I'm going to contradict myself in a sense here, because although I think AI will bring a level of personalization to learning, which will be unmatched to even the best teacher on the planet will not be able to keep up with that, even close. And that in many instances, I think will be a real positive, because, well, they'll be able to have an assessment, which can say, right, these are your strengths, these are your weaknesses. Right, let's design a curriculum which addresses, you know, exactly the things that you need to learn. Let's take into account the way that you learn best, or you know, what engages you. Let's give you some questions, and then we can give you immediate feedback on how you're doing on those questions. We can change the order and sequence and complexity of the questions depending on the answers that you've just given. Like the level of personalization is beyond comprehension of what a teacher can give.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's then eroding that shared experience. So like the one unique contribution will potentially be eroded. And so the idea is that the environment is set up specifically to make social connections. Like that is the main purpose. You go to school to learn how to be a child, you know, how to be part of a group of peers, how to interact with other people. And that has to be at the forefront of a future educational system, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, because oftentimes you're thinking about the curriculum or maybe the skills you need to learn, but sometimes it is, those social connections and those social skills that may be the only place you're developing them and become maybe even more useful for your actual life going forward. Okay, cool. I think that's a great place to end the conversation. It's really great speaking to you. Thanks for coming on the podcast. And I hope we do this again sometime. It was really cool.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Lovely speaking to you.
Yeah, you too. See you in a bit, man. Cheers.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.